Joined now by Bill Snyder. He's an entomologist at the University of Georgia, and he was kind enough to participate in a story that we did in our March issue of Specialty Crop Grower magazine, where we kind of dug into the whitefly issue and problem, which has certainly become a big challenge in the Southeast, Georgia, Florida, Carolinas, Alabama. And just one thing that jumped out at me was the recent Savannah Southeast Regional Fruit and Vegetable Conference. They dedicated a whole morning session to whitefly. So to me, that kind of indicates the severity of the issue. So, Bill, we appreciate you jumping on here and talking a little bit more about some of your research.
Yep, glad to do it.
Great. Well, one of the things we referenced in the story were the really bad whitefly years of 2016 and 2017. And I know that that was before, a little bit before you got to UGA, but I'm sure you've heard the legend of the whitefly years, how bad they were. Talk a little bit about what you heard about those seasons and what dictated, the severity of the problem.
Yeah, so we were lucky whenever I moved out to University of Georgia. I was at Washington State University for 20 years doing vegetable pest research before coming out here. We were able to inherit a nice data set that some folks down at UGA Tifton had collected over several years, where they were monitoring whiteflies at 120 locations every week during the growing season, every other week outside of the growing season, over 2 years. So it's just a really incredible data set. And from that, we were able to do some modeling of what correlated with higher whitefly numbers. So we looked at things like weather, what crops were growing nearby, what was the pattern of insecticide use in those landscapes. And from that modeling, we've got a pretty clear result that the main driver of whitefly outbreaks seem to be extreme heat and drought. So in those couple of years, those two things tend to go together. It's hard to separate out drought from extreme heat. But those two things happening together, that extreme weather, seem to be really tightly correlated with whitefly outbreaks. And when you're working with a big, complex, real-world data set like that, you don't often get a real clear pattern when you're trying to model out what was happening. But that really was the case with those data. It was the heat and the drought that seemed to be the big trigger of whitefly outbreaks.
I remember I was visiting my home in Georgia, probably 2017, and I was really nowhere near a field of anything, but there were literally white flies in the air, and I had never seen that before. And so I guess that just is another example of how bad it was. Wanted to have you on to talk a little bit about the predictive modeling that you're working on. We mentioned it briefly in the story, but thought it'd be good to hear in the video to dig a little bit deeper into what that looks like and what how it might be useful to growers.
Yep. So the dream, obviously, for us, and I'm sure the growers that much more, would be able to know in a given year at a given time and place, where our whitefly is going to be a problem. And if you could know that the conditions look right for 3 weeks out, 4 weeks out, we expect whiteflies to be really bad, then people could at least start to prepare. So know what fields to look at, start getting themselves ready to deal with a whitefly problem. So with the work I mentioned earlier, we thought that it seemed pretty clear that heat and drought were what were important. Whiteflies obviously move from one crop to another throughout the year. And at the hottest, driest times of the year, whiteflies seem to be spending most of their time in cotton. So in years since then, we've started to focus in on looking at drought-stressed cotton in particular. So we did a big study where we compared irrigated cotton fields where they're under center pivot irrigation. So the center of the field is well watered, but usually the corners are planted too. Those are relatively drought stressed. And from that, we were able to confirm that it really is that drought stressed cotton that seems to be generating the biggest numbers of whiteflies. So that gives us our indication that when you have heat and drought, when you have a lot of cotton in a landscape, you're going to have whitefly problems. But the next step would be to use that information to start to be able to predict, like I just mentioned. So if we know that you have a vegetable field, fall planted vegetable field that's in an area with a lot of drought stressed cotton, then you can know that those whitefly problems are going to be coming down the pike. We've also been taking use of, there are satellite images available that can show for a whole landscape where the plants are more or less drought stressed. And so that gives us kind of real-time information on where we're seeing a lot of drought stressed cotton in a landscape and can expect whiteflies to be problem kind of down the road before too long.
So do you envision this down the road being almost like an app or something that growers could tap into as it gets further developed?
Yeah, it's exactly what we want to do. So be able to feed in weather information, maybe some of these satellite image information, be able to tell a grower, if I have this field, 2 miles northeast of Tifton, we think the whiteflies are going to be getting there in about 2 or 3 weeks. So to have something like that where a grower could just put in their GPS coordinates and know for this field, the whiteflies are going to be here in X amount of days, weeks, whatever. So to have really site-specific predictive information on where whiteflies are going to be a problem.
I say, I know that'd be very useful. Now, could this be, we're talking whiteflies here, could this be expanded to other insect pests?
That'd be great. Yeah, there's a guy named Glenn Rains in my department down at Tifton who's actually working on automated sampling machines where he has a little suction sampler that brings insects into sort of a white sticky tape, and then AI looks at those pictures and extracts out what the insects are. So far he's doing that for whiteflies, but you should be able to eventually do that for all different types of insects, including beneficial insects, and sort of work from there to have a very generalized predictive process. We have automated sampling of insects and then predicting where and when certain insect pests are going to be problems down the road. So that'd be the dream.
Excellent. And speaking of timelines and the future of this research, I know you know, you're continuing this work. Talk a little bit about going forward. When growers might be able to have something like this at hand.
Yep. So we're hoping, not too far out. So this kind of research is expensive. We are sampling tons of cotton fields, 40, 50, 60 cotton fields multiple times, doing other types of trapping. Then you have to have people developing the models, so on and so forth. So we need research funding for that. We've got a couple big grant proposals submitted to USDA. Nothing's moving forward right now on any grants at USDA. So if Washington, D.C. can kind of get itself worked out, we're ready to move just as soon as that funding kind of gets moving again. We're hoping one of these days,
Excellent.
things can start to move forward again.
Excellent. Well, fingers crossed on that. And we certainly appreciate you joining us to talk a little bit more about whiteflies and the work you're doing. And thanks again for coming on.
Yep, glad to do it.